There is a house that still stands. Not in myth, not in legend. In Natchez, Mississippi, right there on the bluffs above the river, where the magnolias bloom every spring as if nothing ever happened beneath their roots. The walls are old. The wood is dark. And if you press your ear against the plaster, some people who have stood in that house and felt the air shift. Some say you can still hear something. Not wind, not settling timber, something older. Tonight, we are going to tell you a story that was almost erased from history. A story about a man who believed he owned other human beings, and about the people who proved, in ways he never anticipated, that the soul cannot be owned, cannot be chained, and most remarkably, cannot always be made to leave. This is the story of the Hargrove Plantation, of Colonel Edmund Hargrove, of a man named Isaiah, and of a house where, even today, no one seems to have died completely. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear did not come from a novel. It came from letters, from journals, from courthouse records, and from the mouths of descendants who still carry this story like a weight they were born into. And I promise you, by the time this is over, you will never look at an old Southern house the same way again. Natchez, Mississippi, 1847. If you had stood on the main boulevard of Natchez in the spring of that year, you would have seen something that the history books rarely describe with honesty. Not the romance of white columns and magnolia blossoms, but the machinery of a world built on suffering. The air smelled of red clay and river water. The streets were wide and the mansions were impressive, grand architectural statements that said, in a language money always speaks clearly, "We have arrived. We are powerful. We intend to stay." Colonel Edmund Hargrove was one of those men. He was 51 years old in 1847, broad-shouldered, silver-haired at the temples, with the kind of posture that comes not from military service, though he had served, but from a lifetime of never having to bend for anyone. His voice was low and unhurried. His eyes were pale gray, the color of sky before a storm. He owned the Hargrove Plantation, 400 acres of cotton fields that stretched south from the house toward the river. He owned the house, a two-story Greek Revival structure with 6 white columns across the front and wide verandas where he liked to drink bourbon in the evenings and watch the sun go down over land he believed, completely and without doubt, was his. And he owned 200 people. That sentence does not get easier to say. It should not get easier to say. 200 men, women, and children, human beings with names, with memories, with the same capacity for love and grief and pride that Edmund Hargrove possessed, reduced, in the eyes of the law and in Hargrove's own accounting ledgers, to property. Livestock, assets to be depreciated. His wife, Catherine, was a different kind of person. She was 38 in 1847. She had come from a Charleston family that also held enslaved people, so she was not innocent, and history should not remember her as such. But there was something in Catherine Hargrove that her husband did not possess. Doubt. A quiet, persistent, consuming doubt that she swallowed every morning with her tea and carried through her days like a stone in her chest. She taught Sunday school to the children of the plantation, a practice Edmund tolerated because it made him appear, to visiting ministers and neighbors, like a man of Christian character. What Edmund did not know or chose not to examine too closely was what Catherine actually taught in those sessions. She taught them to read, not openly, not in defiance of the law she would have acknowledged aloud, but quietly, carefully, one letter at a time, pressed into the hands of children who understood, instinctively and without being told, that this knowledge was dangerous and therefore precious. And then, in the autumn of 1847, a wagon arrived. It came from a plantation in Georgia that had gone bankrupt. A debt settlement, a sale of assets, the kind of transaction that appeared in the ledgers as simply 3 received adults and 1 minor. Isaiah, age 32. Ruth, his wife, age 28. Eliza, their daughter, age 6. The records note nothing else about them. Records like that never did. But here is what the records could not capture. Isaiah stepped down from that wagon and looked at the Hargrove house, at the white columns, at the fields stretching away in all directions, at the faces of the people already there watching him with eyes that communicated everything and nothing at once, and something crossed his face. Not defeat, not resignation, calculation. His daughter Eliza reached up and took his hand. His wife Ruth stood close beside him, her jaw set, her eyes steady. And Isaiah looked at the Hargrove plantation the way a chess player looks at a board that seems to favor his opponent. He was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The first thing you need to understand about Isaiah is that he had been here before. Not on this plantation, not in Natchez, but in this position, in the position of a man who possesses intelligence that his captors simultaneously depend upon and fear. Isaiah had lived in that tension his entire adult life. In Georgia, he had been a carpenter. Not because anyone asked what his talents were, but because whoever had enslaved him before had recognized, practically, that a man who could build things was worth more than a man kept only in the fields. So Isaiah had learned to build. He had learned to measure and calculate and join wood in ways that were invisible when done correctly, the kind of craftsmanship that disappears into its own success. And he had learned something else in Georgia, from a young Quaker teacher who had passed through one winter and left behind, quietly, the most dangerous gift he could have offered. Isaiah could read. Not fluently, not yet, but enough. Enough to understand what was written in the notices posted in town. Enough to decipher the maps he had seen hung on the wall of the overseer's office. Enough to know that there was a direction called north, and that north meant something. He kept this knowledge hidden the way you keep a candle hidden in a storm. Cupped in both hands, turned away from the wind, never let out of your possession. It was Catherine Hargrove who found it. She did not find it through surveillance or suspicion. She found it the way one mind recognizes another. Obliquely, unexpectedly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. It was February of 1848. Catherine was organizing the plantation's household accounts, a task Edmund left entirely to her, not out of respect but out of disinterest in the details of domestic management. Isaiah had been assigned to repair a section of the veranda, and he was working quietly outside the window of the room where Catherine sat with her ledgers. She dropped a paper. It slid through the window gap and landed near where Isaiah was working. He retrieved it, and before he handed it back, in that fraction of a second that changes histories, his eyes moved across the page. Catherine saw it. Not the movement of his eyes. Anyone might glance at paper handed to them. What she saw was something more specific. The small, involuntary pause of a person who is actually reading, actually comprehending, actually registering what the words mean. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine said very quietly, "Can you read that?" Isaiah's face became completely still. It was the stillness of a man calculating risk at the speed of instinct, the lifetime practice of deciding, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, what truth would cost him. "No, ma'am," he said. Catherine looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I think you can. And I think that if you come to the back of the library Tuesday morning, when Colonel Hargrove is in town, I can make sure you can do it better." It was, in its quiet way, one of the most consequential sentences spoken in that house. They met 11 times over the following 8 months. Always when Edmund was away. Always in the back room of the library that faced the garden, where the sound of the mockingbirds covered the sound of pages turning. Catherine brought books. Isaiah brought the carpenter's precision he applied to everything. Methodical, patient, building letter by letter the way he built with wood, joint by joint, with nothing left to chance. By September of 1848, he was reading with fluency that would have been recognized in any schoolroom in the country. By October, he had read 3 of the books in Catherine's collection, including, on a day that Catherine would later write about in a private journal that survived the war, a copy of the United States Constitution. "He read the preamble aloud," she wrote. "He read it quietly but clearly, and then he looked up at me and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. And then he said, 'They wrote this about themselves.' And I understood, in that moment, that I had no words equal to what he meant. I have no words for it now." What Catherine did not know, what she could not have known, was that Isaiah was doing more than reading. He was writing. At night, in the cabin he shared with Ruth and Eliza, by light so thin it barely qualified as light, Isaiah was composing letters. Letters that would never be mailed, that were designed never to be mailed. They were addressed to his daughter. They were written in language a 6-year-old could not yet understand, in the hope that someday she would be old enough and free enough to read them. He was building her a record, a testimony. Proof that he had existed, had thought, had loved, had planned, proof that no ledger entry could provide. Edmund Hargrove found out in November. Not about the letters. About the reading. One of the house servants. History does not record who, and perhaps that ambiguity is its own kind of mercy, told Edmund that his wife was meeting with an enslaved man in the library. Edmund did not confront Catherine first. He confronted Isaiah. What happened in that confrontation was recorded later by an overseer who witnessed part of it. Edmund demanded to know what Isaiah had been taught. Isaiah said nothing. Edmund struck him. Isaiah did not fall. Edmund struck him again, harder, with the kind of force that a man uses when he is trying to break something. Not the body could be broken easily enough, but the composure, the stillness, that infuriating, unbearable dignity that Isaiah wore the way other men wore their skin. Isaiah did not break. He stood. He bled. He looked at Edmund Hargrove with those steady dark eyes, and he said nothing, and he did not look away, and he did not break. The overseer wrote that Colonel Hargrove left the room looking shaken. Not angry, shaken. As if something he had always believed about the nature of his power had been tested and found to be less solid than he had supposed. Catherine was confined to the house for 2 weeks. Isaiah was sent to the fields. But the letters remained hidden, inside the hollow of a beam in the cabin wall, exactly where he had put them. And every night, after the work was done and the children were asleep, Ruth pressed her hand against that beam. Not to check on them, just to know they were there. To know that something of Isaiah's mind existed in a place where no one could touch it. Now I want to hear from you. You have just witnessed 2 chapters of one of the most extraordinary hidden stories from the era of American slavery. Isaiah's intelligence, Catherine's guilt, Edmund's crumbling certainty, and Ruth, pressing her hand against a wall in the dark. Tell me in the comments, who do you think carries the most weight in this story so far? Isaiah, Ruth, or Catherine? And do you think Edmund truly feared what he saw in Isaiah, or did he simply not understand it? Leave your thoughts below. And do not go anywhere, because what happens next changes everything. The summer of 1852 arrived in Natchez the way bad news often arrives, quietly at first, then all at once. It had not rained since April. By June, the cotton fields were thinning. By July, the earth had cracked in long jagged lines that looked, from a distance, like a map of somewhere no one wanted to go. The river was low. The air was thick and still and hot in a way that felt personal, as if the heat had a grievance. Edmund Hargrove was losing money, and men who are losing money are men who are looking for someone to blame. He found several. He reduced food rations in July. He extended working hours in August. He hired a new overseer, a man named Caswell, who had come from Alabama and who brought with him a reputation for efficiency that everyone who heard it understood was a euphemism for cruelty. Isaiah, now back in the fields after 4 years of what could euphemistically be called careful invisibility, watched all of this with the same calculating attention he brought to everything. He was not the only one watching. There were others on the Hargrove plantation who had been measuring the temperature of things for a long time. Men like Marcus, a 40-year-old field worker who had been at Hargrove for over 2 decades and who had seen cycles of drought and cruelty before. Women like Tessie, who worked in the kitchen and moved through the house like a shadow and heard everything. Isaiah began talking to them, carefully, in fragments, in the language that enslaved people had developed over generations for exactly this purpose. A language of indirection and metaphor and apparent innocence that said one thing to a listener who wasn't meant to understand and something entirely different to those who were. He was not planning an armed revolt. History tends to reach for that word, revolt, as if it is the only form that resistance can take. Isaiah understood something that the people who write histories often miss, that the most durable form of resistance is not the one that ends in fire, but the one that the fire cannot reach. He was planning something quieter and more permanent. He was planning an exodus. Not all at once, that would be impossible, but in pieces, in small, carefully spaced departures that Hargrove would not immediately recognize as a pattern. One family, then another, time to seasons, to the movement of patrols, to the phase of the moon, routed through a network that Isaiah had been constructing carefully and over years, through the letters he had exchanged. Hidden inside supply wagons, tucked beneath floorboards, with contacts along what we now call the Underground Railroad. He had been building this infrastructure since 1849, since the first book, since the Constitution. September of 1852 was when Caswell, the new overseer, found evidence of it. Not the full plan, not the letters, but a small thing, a symbol marked on a specific fence post in a specific way, that Caswell recognized from descriptions he had heard in Alabama. It was a signal marker, part of a route. Caswell went to Edmond that night. What Edmond did next is documented in two separate accounts. One from a Natchez newspaper that carried a brief item about unrest at a local plantation, and one from a letter written by a Methodist minister who had been visiting the area and who was appalled by what he witnessed. Edmond called an assembly. He stood on the veranda of his house, those white columns behind him, the cracked earth of the drought-year fields in front of him, and he gave a speech about loyalty and consequence. He named no names. He announced new restrictions. And then he had Caswell make an example. The minister's letter does not describe the details. He wrote only, "What I witnessed this day I cannot commit fully to paper, but I can say that I left that plantation believing, for the first time in my life, that there is a sin so complete and so systemic that no individual act of contrition can address it. The stain is in the soil itself." Isaiah was not the one made an example of. Edmond had not identified him, could not identify him because Isaiah's role in what Caswell had found was invisible in exactly the way Isaiah had designed it to be. But Isaiah saw what happened, and he understood that the calculation had changed. That night, Catherine disappeared. Not fled, disappeared. She was in the house at supper. She was gone by midnight. Edmond found her, after 3 days of a search that the same Natchez newspaper described as a brief illness that kept Mrs. Hargrove indisposed. In a small church 12 miles from the plantation, sitting in a pew in the dark, she came home. She said nothing about where she had been or what she had seen, but those who knew her said she was different afterward. Not broken, different, as if something had been clarified, as if the doubt she had carried for years had finally become something harder and more specific. A decision. I want to stop here for a moment. If you have stayed with this story all the way to this point, through the heat of that Mississippi summer, through Isaiah's invisible architecture of resistance, through Catherine sitting alone in that dark church, then I want you to know something. Thank you. Genuinely and sincerely. You are the kind of viewer that this kind of story deserves. The kind of person who understands that history is not just dates and battles, it is people. It is decisions made in the dark, under pressure, with everything at stake. The best is still ahead. What happens in the next 2 chapters, what Isaiah does, what Ruth and Eliza risk, and what is found inside the walls of that house decades later, is the part of this story that most people never hear. Stay with us. We are almost there. Ruth made her decision in October of 1852. She made it the way most irreversible decisions are made. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones, each one adding weight to the last, until one morning she woke before dawn and understood that the decision had already been made and all that remained was to act on it. Eliza was 11 years old enough to be sold, old enough to be gone in the kind of transaction that appeared in ledgers as simply one transferred female minor. Ruth had watched that happen to other children on that plantation. She had watched mothers come back from the fields to find the cabin empty. She was not going to watch it happen to hers. The plan had been set for months. Isaiah had constructed it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. The route went south first, counterintuitive, and that was the point. South along the river to a contact in a fishing settlement, then northwest by wagon to a Quaker community in Tennessee, then north through Kentucky along the network. Ruth memorized the route from a map that Isaiah had drawn in charcoal on a piece of wood and then burned. She memorized the names, the safe names, the ones to say and to whom. She memorized the signals. She had the kind of memory that comes from a lifetime of having to hold on to things no one will write down for you. Isaiah was not going with them. This was the part of the story that Ruth had argued against for months. She had argued quietly, in the hours after midnight when Eliza was asleep, in the particular urgent whisper of people who cannot raise their voices. Isaiah had listened to every argument she made with the same focused attention he brought to everything she said. And he had told her each time the same thing. If I go, they follow within a week. If I stay, they look at me and think the problem is solved. Every day I am here is another day you are on the road before they stop looking for a man. Ruth understood. Understanding did not make it bearable. On the night of October 14, 1852, during a fierce autumn rainstorm that provided the best possible cover, Ruth and Eliza Hargrove, or rather Ruth and Eliza, who had never belonged to anyone named Hargrove, left the plantation through a gap in the fence that Isaiah had spent 3 weeks engineering to look like ordinary decay. Isaiah watched them go from the doorway of the cabin. He watched until the dark and the rain had taken them completely. Then he closed the door. And then, this is documented in a single line, in the letter of a free black woman who had been given the account later by Ruth herself. He sat down on the floor of that empty cabin and he wept. For the first time in anyone's memory, Isaiah wept. And then he stopped. And then he went back to work. What Isaiah did in the following months, the months after Ruth and Eliza's departure, when Hargrove's men were searching for them and Caswell was watching everyone with paranoid intensity, was something that only became fully understood decades later, when the house was finally dismantled for renovation in 1923. The workers who took apart the Hargrove house found things inside the walls. Not treasure. Not weapons. Something stranger and more powerful. They found names. Carved into the interior faces of the structural beams, the surfaces that were never meant to be seen, that had been sealed inside the walls when the house was built. They found names carved with the controlled precision of a carpenter who knew exactly what he was doing. Hundreds of names, each one accompanied by a year, some with a small mark beside them that later scholars would identify as a freedom marker, a symbol used in Underground Railroad correspondence to indicate a successful passage. Isaiah had spent those months going through the house on legitimate carpentry assignments, repairs, replacements, the ordinary maintenance of a large property, and he had used every access to a wall cavity, every interior beam, every hidden surface to carve a record. The names of the people who had passed through. The names of the people who were still there. The names of the children. All of them, permanent inside the house that was supposed to stand as a monument to the man who believed he owned them. Edmund Hargrove had built a house to declare his power. Isaiah had turned it into a monument to the people Edmund tried to erase. Isaiah himself disappeared in the spring of 1853. The plantation records show, in Edmund's own handwriting, a terse entry, Isaiah absconded. No recovery. No recovery. Edmund did not know, and would not know for the rest of his life, that he was living inside the monument Isaiah had made. That every wall he touched, every beam the house rested on, was carrying a record he had never authorized and could never erase, because he could never see it. The house, after all, was still standing. The Civil War ended in April of 1865. Edmund Hargrove was 69 years old. The plantation was a fraction of what it had been. Land sold off to pay debts, the fields gone untended, the white columns still standing but in the particular way of things that are maintained by habit rather than vitality. Like a posture held too long. Catherine had died in 1861, of what the death certificate listed as a prolonged wasting illness. Those who knew her said she had simply decided to stop. That in the last years of her life, the weight she had carried had finally exceeded what a person could carry and still choose to continue. She is buried in the plantation cemetery, in the shade of a live oak tree. There is a headstone with her name. Below her name, carved in letters that are not in the same style as the rest of the inscription, added later by a hand that was never identified, are 2 words, she knew. Edmund Hargrove died in 1869. The house passed through several owners over the following decades, each one leaving it a little more worn, a little more forgotten, until by the early 20th century it was simply another old building in a part of a country that preferred not to examine its old buildings too closely. And then came 1923. The renovation workers who opened the walls of the Hargrove house did not immediately understand what they had found. The foreman's initial report, preserved in a local historical society archive, describes the carvings as extensive markings of unknown origin, possibly decorative or ritualistic. Decorative. It took a historian named Dr. Mabel Forsyth, a black woman from New Orleans, who had heard rumors about the house and driven to Natchez specifically to investigate, to understand what she was looking at. She spent 3 days inside the partially dismantled house, documenting every beam, every surface. She counted 412 names. 412 individual people, each one recorded in that same careful, controlled hand. She recognized the carving style from documents she had studied. She had seen something similar on a smaller scale in other structures associated with underground railroad networks. The combination of names, years, and freedom markers was consistent with documentation practices she had encountered in other sources. And then she found on the central support beam in the structure's foundation, the beam that held the entire house up, something that made her sit down on the floor of that half-dismantled house and stay there for a long time. A single sentence, carved in letters slightly larger than the others, in the kind of English that a man might write who had learned it from books, who had absorbed its rhythms from the Constitution and from the Bible and from the letters he had written by candlelight to a daughter he was sending north without him. The sentence read, "This house will stand as long as the memory of these names stands with it. When it falls, we will already be free." Dr. Forsyth's report was published in 1924 in a small academic journal and largely ignored. She donated her documentation to a university archive, where it sat for decades until the civil rights era brought a new generation of historians to exactly this kind of material. Today, the names Isaiah carved are part of a permanent historical record. Researchers have been able to trace some of them, to match the names on those beams to names in other records, in church documents, in the records of free black communities in Ohio and Michigan and Canada. Some of them made it. The record confirms it. Ruth and Eliza, Isaiah's wife and daughter, are among those who can be traced. There is a record of a woman named Ruth and a girl named Eliza arriving in a Quaker community in Tennessee in November of 1852. There is a marriage record for an Eliza, daughter of Ruth, in Ontario, Canada, in 1866. She married a man named James. They had 4 children. Isaiah himself was never traced with certainty. There are possibilities. A man named Isaiah recorded in a free black community in Detroit in 1858. A carpenter who gave his age as approximately 40 and who had no further records after 1871. Could be him. Historians believe it probably is. What is certain is this: the names are still there. Some of the beams were preserved when the house was finally and fully taken down in 1941. They are in an archive now, a climate-controlled room in a university library, where you can make an appointment and see them. 412 names, carved by a man who understood with absolute clarity that the most powerful thing he could do was refuse to let them be forgotten. That the most durable form of resistance is not the kind that burns. It is the kind that holds up a house. And so the house stood, and the names were inside it the whole time, waiting to be found, waiting, as Isaiah had known they would be, for the moment when someone finally looked inside the walls. 412 names. One carpenter. One decision. One sentence carved into the foundation of a house that was built to declare one man's power and became, instead, a monument to everyone he tried to erase. This is what history looks like when you look inside the walls. Not the history of the men with the columns and the ledgers. The history of the people who held up the house. Now it is your turn. I want to know what you think. Leave me a comment below. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it Isaiah's decision to stay behind? The sentence he carved in the foundation? Ruth's memory of a route she burned? Or perhaps Catherine, sitting alone in that dark church, making a decision no one recorded? Every comment you leave tells me that this kind of story, the kind that history tried to bury, that researchers worked for generations to recover, is worth telling. And that matters. If this story moved you, if you felt something in those walls, please subscribe to this channel. We bring stories like this every week. Stories that were almost lost. Stories that someone somewhere worked very hard to preserve. Stories that deserve to be heard by more people than currently know them. And when you are done here, right there in your recommendations, there is another story waiting for you. A story of a different kind of house. A different kind of resistance. Another set of names that someone tried to erase and could not. We will be here. We always will be.